There is a strange shift that happens in certain relationships. While you are trying harder, explaining more, and holding on emotionally, the other person seems distant or uninterested. But the moment you stop chasing, stop begging, and start pulling away, their behavior suddenly changes. They come back. They text again. They act interested again. Sometimes even more than before. Today we will talk about the second you stop begging, they come back. Here's why so. Before we start, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to my channel. 10. Your distance breaks their sense of control. When you are constantly chasing, explaining, or begging, the dynamic becomes predictable. They start to understand your patterns. That you will respond. You will stay emotionally engaged. And you will keep trying to fix things, no matter how they behave. But the moment you pull away, that predictability disappears. Your reactions are no longer guaranteed. Your attention is no longer automatic. And your emotional availability is no longer something they can rely on. That shift creates discomfort. Not necessarily because they suddenly miss love, but because the emotional structure they were used to has changed. The balance feels different. And the control they were accustomed to no longer works in the same way. So their return is often less about deep emotional realization and more about reacting to that disruption, trying to restore what feels familiar again. 9. Silence creates curiosity, not always love. When you stop reaching out, your silence becomes noticeable. There is suddenly a gap where your attention, messages, reactions, and emotional presence used to be. And the human mind does not ignore gaps easily. It starts filling them with questions. Why? Are they quiet? Did something change? Are they moving on? Do I still have access to them? But this response is not always emotional love. In many cases, it is curiosity triggered by absence and uncertainty. And that curiosity can feel powerful enough to pull someone back into contact, even if nothing meaningful has changed internally. 8. Your value increases when you become less available. Human psychology tends to assign more value to things that are less available. When you were always present, always responding, and always trying, your attention felt guaranteed. But when you step back, your presence suddenly becomes less predictable, less accessible, more uncertain. And that shift can make you appear more valuable in their perception, even though nothing about your actual worth has changed. It is not necessarily love growing, it is perception adjusting to scarcity. 7. They react to losing emotional supply. In many unhealthy dynamics, one person becomes a consistent source of emotional supply, attention, validation, reassurance, or support. When that supply is suddenly reduced or removed, it creates a noticeable emotional gap. And that gap can trigger attempts to reconnect, messages, apologies, or sudden affection, not always because of emotional clarity, but because something familiar is missing. What looks like love returning is sometimes just a response to loss of access. 6. Ego gets triggered. Not just emotion. Sometimes, when someone comes back, it is not really about missing you in an emotional way. It is about ego. It is about how your absence affects their self-image. When you stop chasing, stop reacting, or stop being emotionally available, it can feel like rejection to them. Not necessarily rejection of love, but rejection of control, attention, or importance. And that creates discomfort for the ego. So instead of accepting the change, they may return to reassert their presence. They might try to regain attention, reestablish influence, or simply test whether they still have access to your emotional response. It is less about connection and more about confirmation. Confirmation that they still matter in the same way they used to. 5. Your withdrawal breaks the power dynamic. When you stop begging, over-explaining, or constantly trying to fix things, something important shifts in the dynamic. You are no longer placing yourself in the lower emotional position where you are always chasing clarity, approval, or resolution. Instead, you start stepping back. And that shift quietly changes the balance of the interaction. The pattern they were used to no longer functions the same way. What once triggered responses, explanations, or emotional reactions from you is no longer getting the same result. And when a familiar pattern breaks, people don't always respond with understanding. Sometimes they respond with testing. They want to see if the old dynamic still exists. So they may return, reach out, or behave in ways that seem familiar again. Not always out of clarity, but out of instinct to check what still works. 4. They miss the version of you that was overgiving. In some cases, what they respond to is not your full presence as a person, but a specific version of you, the one that was highly available, emotionally responsive, and constantly giving, the version that overextended itself to maintain connection, peace, or closeness. When that version of you disappears, the change becomes noticeable. Not because the relationship was necessarily healthy, but because the dynamic was familiar. And familiarity can feel powerful, even when it wasn't balanced. So they may try to pull you back into that old role, the one where you gave more, explained more, and tolerated more. Not always because it was right, but because it benefited the pattern that already existed. And when you step out of that role, the dynamic is no longer the same, which is why the reaction often comes when your behavior finally changes. 3. Intermittent attention makes them re-engage. If the relationship was inconsistent before, your withdrawal increases uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable for the human mind because it removes predictability. When someone is unsure whether they still have access to you, their attention, or your emotional response, it can trigger a strong urge to check the situation. They may reach out just to see if you are still available, still responsive, or still emotionally connected. But this re-engagement is not always driven by emotional depth or real reflection. In many cases, it is simply a reaction to uncertainty, a need to confirm whether the connection still exists, and whether influence is still present. 2. Your detachment feels like loss of control to them. When you stop chasing, explaining, or reacting the same way you used to, you step into emotional independence. You are no longer predictable in the same way, and you are no longer relying on their responses to regulate your emotions. That shift can feel very different in a dynamic where one person was used to having consistent emotional access or influence. So when that pattern breaks, they may feel a sense of loss. Not always emotional loss in the romantic sense, but loss of familiarity and control over the dynamic. And to restore that familiar balance, they return. Not necessarily because everything has changed, but because the new dynamic feels unfamiliar and uncomfortable. 1. The truth. Coming back doesn't always mean change. The most important truth is this: someone coming back does not automatically mean growth, awareness, or real emotional change. Sometimes they return because they miss you, but other times, they return because they miss the attention, the emotional supply, the predictability, or the control they once had in the dynamic. And the only real difference between temporary return and real change is consistency over time. Because without consistent behavior, the cycle often repeats itself, even after multiple comebacks. What do you think about our video? Let me know in the comments below. Before you go, leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.